Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome back to this edition of The Doctor Will See You Now. I hope you're well. I hope your reading is providing great pleasure and taking you into the darkest of places, because that's what we like. Now, anybody who is familiar with the channel knows that when the Doctor gets a chance to go further afield, to meet new authors, it's a very special moment, and that's what we have for our session today. I'm very, very grateful to Serpent's Tail for making this suggestion. So I'd like to welcome Nathan Oates into the consultation. Nathan, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm great. And thank you for having me on. It's a real honor. I love so many of the writers that you've interviewed, so it's very exciting.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and thank you for being part of my patience, shall we say, that I promise to be very gentle. As you can probably guess, listeners, viewers, from Nathan's accent, he is coming to us from across the pond, from the States, and we'll be asking him a little bit more about that as well. But let's start off with a few of your bio details. I read that you did your doctorate in English and creative writing at the University of Missouri. And I wondered, when you were in that period of doctoral studies, did you know then that the book we're going to discuss, which is, of course, A Flaw in the Design, which came out March 23, again, published by Serpent's Tail, as we've said, did you know then that this book would come into being?
That's a good question. I'd like to think that somewhere in there I knew, although I didn't have immediate plans while I was working on the doctorate to do it. Although while I was there, the creative writing doctorate is something that I think you don't have in the UK that we have here in the United States, although creative writing programs I know are growing rapidly.
They certainly are, which is so exciting to see what's happening there.
Yeah. And so the way the doctorate worked where I was is that you would do the coursework of a literature PhD, but then your dissertation would be creative. So it would be a novel or a short story collection, which was supposed to tie into your academic studies. And my real interest in the PhD program was sort of area that I named representations of consciousness. This was like largely centered around modernist representations of consciousness, and like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and Henry James and such. But that sort of obsession of mine has remained since my PhD, and I think is present in this book, which is very much about a particular character's psychology and his interiority and the sort of unraveling of that, which has always been a kind of story that I've loved reading, and so I wanted to try writing it.
I think, as you say, now it makes wondrous sense, thinking of your studies and that focus, and to think of those inner monologues that really inform the text in A Flaw in the Design. And now that you've said this, and readers, when you step into these pages, and you can now say, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so that interest definitely carried out of the PhD and through my years writing short stories and then into this novel. So
yeah. Now, you mentioned the short stories, and again, I read that you won the 2012 Spokane Prize for the Empty House. So I have a couple of questions around that. First of all, this collection of short stories, how long did it take you to assemble them?
it took, as with all things for me anyway, with writing, longer than I would have liked to.
Yeah.
The oldest story was about 10 years prior to that, and the newest was, but most of them were written in the 3 or 4 years before.
Yeah.
I was sort of finding my way, I think, as a writer. And so occasionally I would write something good early on back in the early 2000s, but most of the work then didn't sort of fit in the collection. And then I think around 2008, sort of figured out how to tell stories the way I really wanted to be able to tell them.
Yeah.
And then most of the book was written between 2008 and 2011, probably. But there are still some of the older ones from the deeper in the past.
I think it's really exciting to think about a collection that spans, that time and space, and for people then to, to engage with you and your writing over that lens. Now, highly successful collection, winning the Spokane Prize. But for those of us not familiar with that, what is it?
So it's a prize given by a press in Spokane, Washington, which is out
Washington,
of
yeah.
Washington State, out in the west. But Spokane is actually in sort of the interior of Washington, so on the other side of the mountains in the desert region of Washington near Idaho. Yeah, so that was the prize was given by that press, and so yeah, that's what it is. But
That's brilliant. And again, just to highlight that your stories have appeared in the Missouri Review, Alaska Quarterly, the Best American Mystery Stories. So over the vast expanse of the United States that it is, your work has certainly traveled, has it not?
yeah, yeah, it's been published all across the continent. Yeah. Um,
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the Best American Mystery Stories was, I mean, when I wrote the story, the first one that was selected for that anthology, that's put out every year, sort of like Best American Short Stories, and part of that series. And I had no idea that it was a mystery story, but I was, of course, delighted for it to be included
For,
in the collection.
for people to see it like that,
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it
And
gets a much broader audience, so that was, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I do wonder as well often whether how we view things or how we purpose things, and then when it reaches the eyes, ears, the hands of others, do they see it as something else, and that can happen now. So let's hold this up because it is a glorious, glorious book. Look at that. Absolutely delightful cover. And so, I mean, Nathan, I'm unsure, and please, keep me right on this. This is your first full length work, is it?
It's my first full-length novel, yeah. So the
Yeah.
stories came out, but then this is my first novel, yeah. Um,
How did it feel then, if we can call it, going from a 100 meters sprint to a marathon? How did your process change? How did you take the challenge? Did you start off with an idea to develop a full length novel, or did it begin as something else?
Yeah, great question.
Excuse me.
So the way I typically have written short stories, so I'm a professor and I teach all the time, and I have children and very busy. So
Yeah.
short stories have really fit in some ways better into that sort of mode of life and the busyness of that. And the way I like to write stories, I mean, I write them all the time. Now I'm trying to focus on novels, but when I was writing stories, I would write them all the time and sort of slog through and push, but occasionally something would sort of arrive almost whole, and I would write it really quickly. And those were almost always the better stories that I was able to produce, the ones that would sort of arrive all at once. And there was a kind of urgency in the writing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so part of my sort of the challenge for me is that's how I liked to write, like in bursts, was that a novel is very hard to do that if you have an academic calendar and career. So I was lucky enough to be on leave from my job. We were living in Italy. My wife was teaching at the Florence campus at NYU,
Wow. Yeah.
where she teaches. And so I was lucky to not have to teach for a year. And so I thought, I'm going to do that. I had this idea for this book, which originally I had thought was going to be a short story, but immediately became clear to me that the story was too big to fit into a story. And I thought, I'm going to write this the way I write short stories, just in as much of a sustained burst as possible. So taking Stephen King's advice and on writing, which I had always found sort of intimidating and and sort of difficult, which was to write 2,000 words every day. I was like, all right, I'm going to do that. I have the time
Mhm.
now to do it. So I wrote 2,000 to 3,000 words every day for
Fabulous.
2.5 to 3 months and finished the draft. Then there was a lot of work revising, editing, cutting. The first draft was much too long, and there was a lot. There was a year of work after that to
Yeah.
get it into shape. But that was a real joy for me, and a sort of discovery that I made later, maybe that I probably should have, and how to write novels, because that's really how it works for me. I just try to write them in sprints, and then spend a long time revising, uh, in order to like stay in that space, in
Yes.
the imagined
Yes.
space of the world of the story. to stay with the voice of the character and to sort of be immersed in that world is something that that was a really great experience. I mean, it's a very dark novel, so it seems a little weird to say that it was wonderful to be in Gil's head for the unravels over the course of the novel. But it was exciting for me, and not an experience I'd had before. And so now that's something I try to.
I'm so pleased that you had that opportunity to dedicate yourself to that, and hope, that from that experience that subsequent novels will appear. The psychological thriller, I understand again why you would go down that route, having explained to us what you've explained about studies and previous publications. The darkness of the human mind. There's a beautiful strap line for the book, or a little bit of publicity somewhere that says the cleverest psychopaths hide in plain sight. And so I was wondering, the research that you may have done with regard to the human mind, psychopaths, the dark side of humanity. Have you, I don't want to say, or has it come naturally, because that sounds very bad to say that. I mean, I just wonder again, looking in to develop your characters, did you go into, clinical research at all?
Yeah, not too much clinical research. I'm not. I did read a few articles, mostly published in like popular,
Yeah.
the about children and psychopathology, about like what it means for a child to be a psychopath, and the sort of how disconcerting that is to our sense of self and nurture and all of those questions. But I didn't read deeply into the psychological literature on that. Mostly I read in literature itself, in fiction. So I read novels about sort of dangerous children or troubled children. I mean, the novel that is probably the sort of the parent novel of my novel, or I would like to think of it as such, is The Fifth Child by Doris Lessing.
Yeah.
It's, I think, pretty much a perfect novel, and is about a family that has 4 children, and they decide to have a fifth, and that fifth child arrives and is sort of destroys the family. And it's very morally complex and very interesting and very like propulsive. I think it's a very short novel. It's only about 150 pages, but I love that book, and read it right when I started. I had read it before, then read it again right at the beginning of the novel, and I actually read it 4 times over the revision process of the book, to constantly remind myself of like the high water mark that that I would like aspire to, but of course probably not ever reach, because it's Doris Lessing. And so that book and other novels about sort of troubled children are things that, that's where I turn to, mostly to fiction, honestly. I read all the time and as much as I possibly can, and I know I should read more nonfiction, but I just find myself constantly going back into fiction for everything. So
I understand. I'm like that. The pull of people's creativity, is fascinating. So the choice to make it, that the troubled child, if we can call them that, it was very deliberate that it be a child and not another adult. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think there's something more disconcerting to me anyway about the idea of a child who might be evil. I mean, I think it's this, I mean, through psychology and contemporary psychology, we have a lot of explanations as to how an adult might become, might be turned evil in this world, right? It doesn't seem like it's hard to imagine how that could happen. But for a child to be, and one of the questions for the narrator is this just his fundamental nature? So the narrator is Gil, and the character with whom he becomes sort of obsessed is his nephew, Matthew, whose parents die, and he comes to live with Gil in Vermont with his family. And Gil has sort of afraid of Matthew and has always thought of him as evil, essentially. and he has made this judgment on him and
Mm.
thinks this is just his nature. And so I was very interested in that sort of question. I mean, children, as we know, like they change rapidly and all the time, right? A child
Yeah.
at 9 is not necessarily the same child they are at 12. And by the time they're 17, they could be an altogether different person with several permutations in between. But Gill is, because of the other pressures and plot points in the novel, has this sort of need to see Matthew in a simple way, to see him as just an evil child. And so I was interested in that sort of question, about, you know, selfhood and identity and what it means to be oneself, and all of the sort of questions that attend to nature and nurture and sort of childhood.
Mm. I again think, you know, the concept of identity and how multifaceted we are, depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves, the people that we're with, that there's many iterations of the self contained in one person. And I found that really interesting, Gil, you know, Gil's need to almost fix Matthew in a certain place and not be willing to see the spectrum of identity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting. Now, so Gil Duggan, um, he's a creative writing professor, and so I wondered to what extent, when we get to know this troubled troubled character, to what extent do we find you there, or was it simply that vehicle because it was a world that you could write?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I've always loved, when you're a creative writing student in America, one of the things you're sometimes told is never write about writers. Nobody wants to read about writers, but I have found, at least for myself, that that's not true.
Yeah.
I love reading books about writers. And one of the great sort of joys of broadening my reading in the thriller world is how many novels in that world are about writers and readers and about that sort of dynamic. And that sort of metatextual playfulness, I think, is really fun in books. And so I wanted to write about a writer. I thought that would be fun. Uh, the I wanted him to not be a terribly successful writer. So he's sort of a middling writer, and his career has sort of fallen away. He hasn't published a book in quite a long time in the novel. So he needed to have some way to support himself. And the way in America writers tend to do that is through academia. So I made him a creative writing professor. But I was also very interested in the sort of playfulness of fiction and the stories we tell, and the way that someone like Gil, who spends his life living in that sort of liminal space of
Mm.
fiction, he teaches it, ostensibly writes it, thinks about it all the time, and he's in that sort of space where character is constantly being created, and yet he has, as we've already discussed, this sense of his nephew as like a fixed point of darkness in his life. And I thought that was an interesting tension,
Mm.
something that was fun. And also, I mean, as you say, I'm a creative writing professor, so it's a world I know a lot about. I thought it'd be fun to play with that world workshop. I mean, many of the classroom scenes in the novel
Yeah, yeah.
were much longer in their original version because that's just a world I know so well. But over time, my editor and agent were sort of like helping me pare those down into the sort of story appropriate shape. But that's a world I think is fun and fun to write about.
Very much so. Yeah, I think that, you know, that interaction with students, to see their creative process, their reason for developing the lines that they develop, but of course, to do a full taught session or a full tutorial session maybe doesn't, you know, can't fit into, but to stop the flow of
Right.
of the novel. I think it's a little bit like looking at a police procedural, and they always say, don't they, that if you really wrote police life as it is, you know, nobody would read it because it just wouldn't be exciting in parts. So again, that editing, that keeps this moving. Just to come back to some of those details that you mentioned, so Vermont, you know, of all the states, you know, in this vast nation, Why Vermont?
So I lived in Vermont when I was a kid. My father was an academic, and I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, so sort of in the center of the country. And then we moved from there to Vermont, and and then we moved several other times in my childhood.
Yeah.
But that was the place that I loved Vermont.
Uh-huh.
It was like magic growing up there. It was a beautiful, I mean, it's an extravagantly beautiful part of the United States. I shouldn't say this about the United States, but a lot of it is not that beautiful. But Vermont is really extraordinary. The mountains and the lake, and the severity of the winters, and the beauty of the summers. And then we moved away, and I was always a little, I think, throughout my whole childhood, a little heartbroken to have moved
Yeah.
away. Um, Always sort of hoped to be able to go back. And then when we moved to New York City, which is where I live with my family, we started to go up in the summers to Vermont,
Yeah.
and rent a little cabin on the lake, and started to reconnect with the place. And I was reminded of how deeply I love the place and how evocative I think it is as a place. And so I gave it to the character in a similar but sort of exaggerated way. I think that's sort of how I approach character in order to facilitate plot in novels, is that I take something that's like life, but then make it more so,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I love Vermont, and I find it to be a peaceful, restful place to go. But I gave it to Gil, and it's like a refuge for him. It's like a place he needs to go there. He needs to escape New York. He hates New York City, which I do not. I love New York.
Yeah.
And he flees to Vermont in a way and sees it as a refuge. And it seemed like a place in the United States, and there are others, that one could really feel that way.
Yeah.
And so mostly it's just that it's a place I love, and I wanted to write about. And so it was fun to go back there in my.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you used that, both for the setting of the story, but also for yourself to go back to a place that has that meaning, and be able to be there in the pages, if not necessarily, like you say, you do go back. So thank you for sharing that with us. So thinking of your characters, we've mentioned Gil, and Gil's married to Molly, and they have two daughters, but then they receive into their home the nephew, bereaved nephew. I just wondered, um, did did these characters appear more or less the same time for you? Or were there certain characters that were almost there saying, me first, develop me. I need on these pages.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but they actually did all sort of appear at the same time. The very first thing I ever wrote that became, you know, which changed enormously and is not really in any way in the book, but was a scene that involved all of the family. So Gil and his wife Molly and their two children, their two daughters, and Matthew. And so they were sort of all there together. I was interested in the sort of the tension that develops between those characters, the different dynamics, the histories, and the way that just complicates their situation and their sense of themselves and their safety, honestly. And so that's really where it began. The first chapter was Matthew arriving at the house with Gil, and Molly and the girls coming out to greet them. That was the first thing I ever wrote. And so they were all there actually together. I had not actually thought about that before. But I'm interested in that sort of dynamics of the family, which is really at the center of the book.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, on the immediate level, and that level, once removed of the loss of family, but of course we learn that Gil and his sister, who sadly died, they're not close because, and I think I'm giving nothing away because it's in the publicity that people can find, because of something that Matthew did earlier, in his life. And so it made me think about moral dilemmas with regards to family obligations. Often, we hear the thing that blood is thicker than water, but I wonder to what extent, when well, bad blood, um, should we feel obliged, um, to take action when really I wonder, I wonder if Gil had said, "I'm really sorry, but we're not doing this." Well, then you wouldn't have had a book, so we can't, we can't. But I just for one moment I thought, again, the choices that we make and therefore the consequences.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of readers have pointed that out. They're like, why didn't he just say no? Well, I mean, the obvious reason is what you've already said, which is that there'd be no book.
Yeah.
So he had to say yes. I also think that the sort of Matthew comes into their home in this moment of sort of when Gil is in the fugue of grief, right? His sister has died and died very unexpectedly in a sort of tragic car accident, which is mentioned in the first chapter. So I feel like okay to mention. And the and Gil is in that sort of immediate sort of shock, and he's sort of stunned, and he feels this, the deep sort of fugue of grief in that immediate moment, that perhaps leads him to agree to take Matthew in when perhaps he should not have done so, and it's sort of unwise. But as you say, he feels this great obligation. And I think that obligation for him is actually exacerbated by the fact that, or amplified for him by the fact that he is estranged from his sister largely. They're not formally estranged in any technical way, but they barely interact. The incident you mentioned from the past where Matthew put one of Gil's daughters in danger, or perhaps tried to do something even worse to her, that caused a sort of rift between them, but that wasn't the only factor, right? There was social class. They grew up in a sort of middle class family in America, outside of Washington D.C., and then Sharon marries a very, very, very wealthy man, sort of venture capitalist hedge fund money from New York City, and all of a sudden is vaulted into this other life, right? That Gil feels disconnected from, that he's deeply jealous of in some extent, that he is he longs for, but also passes judgment on and has all sorts of negative feelings about. And so that it's not just Matthew's action, it's also these other factors in that.
That context behind. I really enjoyed that aspect though, because I think often British readers, we tend to think that we have the monopoly on the class system. And it's interesting to see that expressed, in a different context, that there are those tensions, and what that does. Because if I'm right in remembering that, of course, Matthew now will inherit this wealth.
Yeah.
And again, how that affects Gil.
Right. And Gil's jealousy, the sense that Matthew doesn't deserve it, that it should go to someone more worthy, even as Gil is aware that that's not how wealth works. It doesn't go to worthiness. It goes to, whoever has claimed it. Yeah. I mean, this issue of social class is really interesting to me. And I think probably for all American writers, it's much more immediate than perhaps it was 20 years ago. But if you live in New York, there's no way to avoid the realities of social class. This is a place that shatters that American illusion that everyone lives in this sort of middle class bubble, because the severity of the wealth and the poverty in New York is so extreme. There's the $100 million apartments and the far other end of the economic spectrum. And so that just is so immediate. And that's part of what Gil also, I mean, I've touched on this before, his feelings about New York are so much tied up with money. The difficulty of living in New York, the expense of it, and the sort of how intimidating he feels.
I mean, one troubled soul, I mean, without a doubt, at various turns, you just think, is there any way to soothe this troubled breast? But yeah, we'll leave people to work through the novel with regard to that. An aspect that where there's yet another turn in the novel and within the creative writing is, of course, Matthew signs up for the class, and his writing develops in a way that starts to disturb Gil. And again, not to go into details of what he's writing, but I wondered for yourself, the whole notion of life imitating art reflecting life. Do you believe that?
Well, I mean, I think if you're a writer, that's so bound up with your experience, right? You go to dinner with friends and there's a certain conversation and you think that's good material. And so at least I do.
Yeah, yeah,
So you're always sort of looking for details, images, overheard bits of conversation, situations, dynamics that might make for good stories or might fit into something that you're working on now. And so for me, the boundary between the making of fiction and life is always, it's always sort of porous, and it's always crossing back and forth in a way that that is probably unusual, or is probably only something that writers feel, or maybe not. Maybe other people do too, but I only know of my own experience. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Because
Um,
sometimes, again, one's experience or lack of experience, and you read something and then it seems to happen, and maybe it's happened before, but you've not noticed it. It's the reading that has brought your attention to something. I think even the simplest thing of vocabulary, certain
yeah.
words that you think I have never, and then it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've been made aware of it, and it's everywhere. Um, so again, Matthew's writing, did it call something into being, or was Matthew just say playing a trick? Well,
Yeah. I mean, playing a trick is a great question, because that's so much at the heart of the book, right? I mean, so much of the joy in fiction writing and reading, yeah, are the tricks that happen. The epitaph for my book is from Nabokov, and
yes, I was going to ask about that. Please, why the choice? Do tell us.
yeah, he he loves tricks, right? I mean, his novels are full of tricks, and that
Yeah,
particular story, Signs and Symbols, is sort of one. I love that story. I think it's beautiful and moving, but it's also sort of one big trick. Um, I won't spend too much time, but I encourage everybody to read Signs and Symbols. I think it's probably his best short story, and has this very fun sort of effect on the reader and twist at the end. And it's fundamentally about a character who has this sort of delusion and obsession. But Nabokov was really important for me in general as I was writing this book, because I was reading, a lot of Patricia Highsmith and a lot
uh-huh.
of other thriller writers, but I also started to notice that a lot of Nabokov's novels are sort of crime novels, basically. I mean, Lolita is a crime novel, and Hellfire and Despair, and a lot of them have at their heart and at the center of the plot a crime, right? Often a
Yeah,
murder. And so I was really interested in the way that he took this sort of crime thriller element and then put this incredibly ornate literary ornamentation around it, and managed to do both in a way that I think was really fun. And I've always been interested in books that sort of hybridize
yes, yeah.
literary techniques, like high literary, whatever, which is a very difficult term to define, and crime or thriller writing. And I loved that in Nabokov, and that discovery I thought was really fun. Um,
I, you raise an interesting point, and the author that I spoke to in my previous session was talking about the notion of hybrid in a different way, but how hybrid sometimes for the publishing world can be tricky because
yeah.
they don't know where to put your book, and they don't know where to market you, or they don't. So for yourself, I mean, there's no doubt about it that I can see where you have been doing this beautiful fusion tapestry, between genre and style. And does it matter to you for your work to have that easy label, or are you glad that it can't totally be held in a certain place?
Yeah. I think when I was younger, I would have cared a lot more. now as I've like gotten older and read more widely and encountered more readers, I care sort of less about
Yeah.
the labels. My hope is just that it reaches readers, and
Yes.
thriller readers and crime readers are some of the most voracious readers in the world.
Yeah.
They read everything all the time in a way that I find really exciting and heartening as a writer. So, and I loved and I've loved, I mean, Patricia Highsmith is a writer, I think, who is sort of a hybrid writer. She's
Yes, definitely. Yeah, yeah.
very much now, I think, considered part of the literary canon. And also, of course, was very famously one of the sort of main crime writers of the 20th century. And so, and her books appeal in both ways. And I love books like that, books that, are more than one thing. Margaret Atwood, I think, is a writer who is
Yes.
so
Yeah.
much that her books are beautiful, complex literary constructs and really fun, sci-fi or dystopian or whatever,
Yeah.
or crime novels sometimes. And so there's so many. I've just always loved those books. I mean, when I was going through my doctorate, to go back to the very first thing I did,
Yeah. Yeah.
so like focused on literary, right? So focused on trying to understand what constituted literary fiction, and how it was made. And after my PhD, as I, went into teaching, I started to broaden out and became more interested in things at the edges that push in. So, I mean, I'm just happy for it to reach readers, I think, through the thriller label. And I do hope it's enjoyable to thriller readers, that it has a chance to reach a bunch of readers it wouldn't otherwise possibly have reached, which is very exciting to me. So,
Again, just to come back, viewers, listeners, if you dare, uh, the dark side of of the human psyche, I highly recommend. Again, it's really interesting to think, if you watched my previous session with Teresa Driscoll, I seem to be being drawn to these psychological thrillers, and the understanding of why we do what we do, what drives us, the situations, the choices that we make. Um, I just have a couple more questions for you, Nathan, if I may. Um, I sometimes ask writers this, but I haven't asked for a while. But I wonder if, as an author, do you write do you write among your characters, or do you write above them? Do you do the helicopter view, or are you there, almost from their perspective?
yeah, I think the latter, from their perspective. I love the limited third person, sort of like
Mhm.
as close to free and indirect discourse as you can get, like where you're in the character's head, but it's not first person. That's my favorite point of view. I mean, I would like to write a first person novel one day, but every time I start working on something, I'm drawn to that perspective, because I feel like in some ways it's almost closer to the character than first person, because the first person has the sense of they're confessing to someone. And so there's this measure of dissembling and information withholding and so on that's going on from the narrator. Whereas when you're in limited third, you're so deep inside the character's mind that you experience it as they do. And I love books like that. And I really liked writing like that. I like being blinkered as the character is blinkered. And having this sort of story, and that way the story can sort of reveal itself to me, in a way that it's being revealed to the character, and then also the reader, which is something that is really fun for me in the writing, to not know everything ahead of time,
Yes.
to
Yeah.
have it unfold. So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
and and if my last question, if I can ask you professionally, well, I've got two. I've still got two, so allow me two. I'm really sorry.
No.
The first one is imagination, and the second one is reality. So, if Gil were a colleague of yours, you're there in the same department. I wonder how you would react to him, and whether you would seek out his company, or whether he would be a colleague that you would hold at arm's length.
That's a great question. I think we'd probably be friends.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I think we would probably get along. I mean, we have a lot of shared similarities, and I mean, if we're teaching in the same program that Gil's teaching in, we're probably the only two creative writers there, so we're
Yeah,
sort of our natural compatriots.
of course. Yeah,
Um, yeah, but yeah, I think we probably would be friends. I had not ever wondered if I would be friends with Gil. I mean, there's so much of me in Gil
yeah,
to a certain extent that it's, of course, like, but then he, spins off of me in
yeah.
extreme ways.
Yeah,
Um,
and you've said this, about different aspects of the book, but how that exaggeration,
yeah.
the taking something beyond, and yeah, it's an exciting technique. So honestly, this is my last question now. With the students that you've worked with over time, have you seen um, have you seen more students wishing to express their writing through crime fiction, thriller kind of writing, or do you think it's a I know there are many subgenres, but if we take crime fiction as a overall, do you think it's something that is of more interest in later years?
That's a good question. Maybe it is. I do think that students now come to writing in a way that's different than when I did when I was in
Yeah,
college years ago. They come through, it's some sort of a new genre, YA.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and the YA genre contains sort of all of the genres at
yeah,
once for young readers. That has fantasy, it has crime, it has horror, it has all the elements of the marketing of adult fiction contained within that genre. And so they read really widely across all of these genres. And so they come to creative writing excited by that, and that's the world they're coming out of. And so I think they're much more open and
mhm,
interested in it than I think readers, or I'm sorry, young students were about 20, 25 years ago. I think there's a great openness to the thing we've talked about, the hybridity,
yeah,
moving between genres, and the sense that you can be a writer and write a fantasy novel and then a crime novel and then a romance, and that is an available way to be a writer is really interesting to me. And I guess I didn't feel that was true when I was younger, but like you had to be a horror
yeah,
writer or you had to be a literary writer. You had to sort of pick your path. And I think young students now feel it's much more open in a way that I think is really exciting and
yeah.
good for them as readers and as writers, and then I think good for the literary culture too.
Without a doubt, I totally agree with you. Um, how exciting! How exciting! I shall talk with my colleagues at the university where I work. I'm close to quite a few creative writing professors and ask them, is this what they're seeing? Nathan, it has been an absolute delight to spend time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Really,
much.
really appreciated your insights, your thoughts. Let's hold this beauty up one more time. Again, viewers, listeners, wholeheartedly recommend A Flaw in the Design. Wish you all the very best with it, Nathan, and without any pressure, I look forward to seeing the next book come into being. Yeah,
I'm working on it. So
yeah, that is great to hear. So for now, I wish you bye bye and hope one day we can meet in person.
Great. That would be wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
A
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.